For 20 years, she thought she was married to a man of God, a pastor, a leader, a husband admired by the community. But one secret hidden in the dark of their bedroom would turn devotion into rage and faith into blood. Sarah believed Michael was everything a woman could want. He preached love from the pulpit every Sunday, blessed marriages, baptized children, and guided lost souls to salvation. Their small Florida town saw them as the perfect couple. Him in his crisp suits delivering powerful sermons, her in the front pew with that practiced smile that said, "We have it all figured out." But perfection, as Sarah would learn, was just another lie wrapped in Sunday best. On the night of June 15th, 2019, the screams from the parsonage shattered more than just the humid summer silence. They shattered 2 decades of carefully constructed deception. What Sarah discovered in their bedroom that night would expose a truth so devastating, so humiliating, that it drove a devoted wife to pick up a kitchen knife and end the man she thought she knew. The blood on those white sheets wasn't just evidence of a crime. It was the final chapter of a marriage built on the most intimate betrayal imaginable. Welcome to Silent Witness True Crime Stories. Thanks to all my viewers and subscribers for your support. Stay tuned for daily true crime updates. Don't forget to subscribe and also download your free ebook by clicking the link in the pinned comment. Tonight, we're uncovering a case that shocked a tight-knit community and left a courtroom speechless. The questions that haunted investigators and still divide public opinion today. What was he hiding for 20 years? What secret was so shameful that a respected pastor chose deception over honesty with the woman who shared his bed every night? Why did she snap after 2 decades of marriage? And could anyone have seen it coming? The answers lie in a web of religious pressure, societal expectations, and personal shame so deep it cost 2 lives, one taken by violence, the other destroyed by the aftermath. This isn't just a story about murder. It's about the crushing weight of living a lie, the devastating power of betrayal, and the moment when a human being reaches their breaking point. Stay with us because the truth behind this case is stranger and more heartbreaking than anything you've heard before. This is the story of how faith, fear, and deception collided in the most tragic way possible. Michael Richardson arrived in Clearwater, Florida in 1999 with all the credentials of a rising star in the evangelical community. At 32, he was charismatic, well-educated from seminary school, and had that rare gift of making every person in his congregation feel personally connected to God's Word. The Sunshine Community Church was struggling with declining membership when they hired him, but within 2 years, Sunday services were packed and the offering plates were overflowing. Sarah Martinez met Michael at a church potluck dinner in 2001. She was 28, worked as a school secretary, and had been praying for the right man to come into her life. Michael seemed like an answer to those prayers. He was thoughtful, respectful, and talked about building a family centered on faith and service. Their courtship was everything Sarah had dreamed of. Long walks discussing scripture, dinners where he listened intently to her thoughts about teaching children, and flowers delivered to her workplace with notes quoting Proverbs about finding a virtuous woman. They married in 2002 in a ceremony that the local newspaper called a celebration of true Christian love. Sarah wore her grandmother's pearl necklace and a dress she'd saved for months to buy. Michael's vows brought tears to half the congregation when he promised to love her as Christ loved the church, completely, sacrificially, and without condition. The reception lasted until midnight, filled with dancing, laughter, and toasts to their bright future together. For the first few years, their marriage seemed blessed. Michael's ministry grew, and they bought a beautiful home near the church. Sarah threw herself into being the perfect pastor's wife, organizing charity drives, leading women's Bible studies, and always having a smile ready for congregation members who needed encouragement. She dreamed of children, and they tried for years to conceive, attending fertility specialists and praying together for God to bless them with a family. But there were strange things that Sarah noticed, small inconsistencies that she initially dismissed. Michael insisted on complete darkness during intimate moments, claiming he was self-conscious about his body. He changed clothes in the bathroom and never undressed in front of her, even after years of marriage. When she suggested romantic getaways or spa weekends, he always had church obligations that prevented travel. Sarah attributed these quirks to his upbringing in a very conservative religious household where modesty was heavily emphasized. The congregation adored their pastor and his wife, but if anyone had looked closer, they might have noticed the strain in Sarah's smile during the later years. At church gatherings, Michael was warm and affectionate, holding her hand and calling her his blessing from above. But at home, he was increasingly distant. Intimate moments became rare and awkward. When Sarah tried to discuss having children through adoption or other means, Michael would change the subject or claim God's timing was different than theirs. By 2018, 17 years into their marriage, Sarah felt like she was living with a stranger. Michael still preached with passion every Sunday about the sanctity of marriage and the importance of honesty in relationships, but something felt fundamentally wrong in their private life. She confided in her sister Lisa that she felt like Michael was hiding something, but she couldn't imagine what. In her mind, her husband was a man of God who had chosen to dedicate his life to serving others. What could he possibly be concealing? The answer to that question would destroy everything she believed about love, marriage, and the man she thought she knew. But behind closed doors, Sarah knew something wasn't right. And one night, she would finally see the truth with her own eyes. June 15, 2019 started like any other Saturday in the Richardson household. Michael spent the morning in his study preparing Sunday's sermon on living in truth, while Sarah worked in their garden, tending to the roses she'd planted when they first bought the house. The Florida heat was oppressive, and by evening the air conditioning was working overtime to keep their home comfortable. Sarah had prepared Michael's favorite dinner, pot roast with all the fixings, but he barely touched it, claiming he wasn't feeling well. For months, Sarah had been growing increasingly frustrated with their lack of physical intimacy and emotional connection. That evening, as they prepared for bed, she made a decision that would change everything. They had been married for 17 years, and she was tired of feeling like a stranger in her own marriage. She was tired of the darkness, tired of the distance, tired of feeling rejected by the man who was supposed to love her most. Michael, as always, turned off all the lights before getting into bed. Sarah waited until she heard his breathing settle, indicating he thought she was asleep. Her heart was pounding as she quietly reached over and flipped on the bedside lamp. What she saw in that sudden burst of light would haunt her for the rest of her life. The man she had been married to for nearly 2 decades, the pastor who preached about truth and honesty every Sunday, had been living the most intimate lie imaginable. Sarah's scream pierced the humid night air. She scrambled backward, falling off the bed and onto the floor, her mind struggling to process what her eyes had revealed. Michael jolted awake, immediately realizing what had happened. The secret he had guarded so desperately for 20 years was exposed in the harsh light of their bedroom lamp. He began sobbing, reaching toward Sarah, who was now cowering against the dresser. "Please, Sarah, let me explain. Please don't leave me. I can explain everything." But Sarah was beyond explanations. The betrayal was so complete, so devastating, that she felt like everything she knew about her life was a lie. The romantic dinners, the wedding vows, the years of trying to conceive children, the sermons about honesty and faithfulness, all of it had been built on deception. She felt like she had been robbed of 20 years of her life, 20 years of being married to someone who didn't even exist. "You lied to me," she whispered, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Every day for 20 years, you lied to me. Every time we made love, every time I believed I knew who I was married to, every time I defended you to people who said something seemed off about you, you were lying to me." Michael begged for forgiveness, explaining through tears that he had been terrified of losing her, that he thought if he could just be a good husband in every other way, this one deception wouldn't matter. He talked about shame, about religious expectations, about growing up in an environment where being different meant being condemned. But Sarah's pain had transformed into something much more dangerous, She stood up, her body shaking with rage, and walked to the kitchen. Michael followed her, still pleading, still trying to explain decades of lies in a few desperate minutes. Sarah's mind was reeling with images. Their wedding night, years of trying to have children, intimate moments that now felt like violations of trust. She opened the drawer where they kept the kitchen knives, and Michael's voice grew more panicked. "Sarah, please. We can work through this. I love you. I've always loved you. This doesn't change how I feel about you." She turned around, holding the largest knife from the set they had received as a wedding gift. "How you feel about me? You don't even know who you are. How could you possibly know how you feel about anyone? If you're still with us, drop 'I'm still here' in the comments. Let's see who's watching this far." What happened next would be debated in courtrooms and analyzed by psychologists, but the facts were undeniable. At 11:47 p.m., neighbors heard screaming from the Richardson house. At 11:52 p.m., Sarah called 911, her voice eerily calm as she reported that she had killed her husband. When police arrived, they found Michael bleeding on their kitchen floor, and Sarah sitting at their dining room table, still holding the knife, repeating over and over, "He lied to me for 20 years. He stole 20 years of my life." The neighbors heard screams that night, but no one expected the horror waiting inside that house, or the devastating secret that had been hidden in plain sight for 2 decades. When Clearwater police arrived at 12:03 a.m., the scene inside the Richardson home was unlike anything the veteran officers had encountered. Sarah sat motionless at her dining room table, still wearing the floral nightgown she had put on hours earlier. The knife lay beside her, and she made no attempt to resist arrest. Her only words to the officers were spoken in a monotone voice. "He lied to me for 20 years. I gave him everything, and he lied to me about everything." Detective Maria Santos, who had worked homicide for over a decade, later said she had never seen a suspect so completely detached from reality. Sarah answered questions mechanically, providing details about the evening's events without emotion. When asked why she killed her husband, she simply repeated, "He wasn't who I thought he was. Our whole marriage was built on lies." The crime scene told a story of sudden, explosive violence. The kitchen showed signs of a struggle: overturned chairs, broken dishes, blood spatter on the walls. The coroner would later determine that Michael had been stabbed 7 times, wounds that suggested both rage and desperation. What puzzled investigators initially was the lack of any history of domestic violence. Neighbors, friends, and congregation members all described the Richardsons as a devoted couple who seemed genuinely happy together. News of the murder spread through Clearwater like wildfire. By Sunday morning, instead of Michael delivering his sermon on living in truth, police cars surrounded Sunshine Community Church. Congregation members gathered in small groups, whispering their disbelief. Janet Morrison, who had known the couple since they married, told reporters, "They were perfect together. Sarah adored Michael, and he treated her like a queen. This makes no sense at all." The arrest made headlines across Florida. Pastor's wife confesses to murder. But the story that emerged over the following weeks would prove far more complex than anyone initially understood. Sarah's sister Lisa was the first person to suggest there might be more to the story than a simple case of domestic violence gone wrong. "Sarah called me around 9 p.m. that night," Lisa told Detective Santos. "She sounded different, like she was in shock. She said she had discovered something about Michael that changed everything, but she wouldn't tell me what. She kept saying, 'I don't know who I've been married to.' I thought maybe she'd found out about an affair or something." The investigation took an unexpected turn when detectives processed evidence from the couple's bedroom. What they discovered would eventually explain Sarah's complete mental breakdown, but it also raised uncomfortable questions about deception, identity, and the limits of human psychology. The evidence suggested that Michael had been concealing something so personal, so fundamental to his identity, that exposure of the secret had triggered what psychologists would later describe as a complete psychological break in his wife. Church members struggled to understand what could have driven Sarah to violence. Michael had been their spiritual leader for 20 years. He had officiated their weddings, baptized their children, and provided comfort during their darkest moments. The idea that he had been hiding something significant enough to drive his wife to murder challenged everything they believed about him. As investigators dug deeper into the couple's private life, they uncovered evidence of Michael's increasing emotional distance over recent years. Credit card records showed he had been seeing a therapist in Tampa, driving over an hour each way to ensure no one in their community would discover he was seeking mental health treatment. The therapist, Dr. Robert Chen, initially refused to break client confidentiality, but eventually provided information that helped explain the events of June 15th. The prosecution began building a case for first-degree murder, arguing that Sarah had time to consider her actions and chose violence over seeking help or leaving the marriage. But the defense team, led by attorney Patricia Gomez, insisted that Sarah had suffered what amounted to psychological torture, and that her response, while inexcusable, was the result of severe mental trauma. Public opinion was divided. Some community members felt sympathy for Sarah, believing she had been the victim of psychological abuse through deception. Others argued that no secret, regardless of how shocking, justified taking another person's life. Online forums debated the case endlessly, with some people sharing their own experiences of discovering that their partner had hidden fundamental aspects of their identity. The case also raised broader questions about marriage, honesty, and the difference between privacy and deception. Religious leaders throughout Florida found themselves in the uncomfortable position of trying to explain how a pastor could live such a profound lie while preaching about truth and moral integrity. Some defended Michael, arguing that everyone has the right to privacy about personal matters. Others condemned him for building his marriage on deception. As the trial date approached, both families were torn apart. Sarah's parents stood by their daughter, insisting she had been driven to temporary insanity by the betrayal. Michael's family maintained that while he may have made mistakes, he didn't deserve to die for them. The congregation split, with some members supporting Sarah and others feeling she had destroyed their beloved pastor for reasons they still didn't fully understand. But as the courtroom prepared for trial, shocking details emerged that made this case even darker than anyone imagined. The full scope of Michael's deception was about to be revealed, and it would force everyone involved to confront questions about identity, truth, and the devastating consequences of living a lie. The courtroom was packed on the morning of October 22, 2019, when the trial of Sarah Richardson began. What emerged during testimony would shock even seasoned legal professionals and force everyone to reconsider what they thought they knew about the case. Dr. Robert Chen, Michael's therapist, took the stand under court order to provide testimony about his sessions with the pastor. What he revealed painted a picture of a man tormented by shame and fear, living in constant terror that his secret would destroy not just his marriage, but his entire career and reputation. Michael had been born with a rare medical condition, Dr. Chen testified. He had been living his entire adult life with a physical condition that he felt made him fundamentally different from other men. He was convinced that if anyone, especially his wife, discovered this condition, they would see him as less than a real man. The condition, while not life-threatening, had profound psychological implications for someone raised in a conservative religious environment where masculinity and traditional gender roles were heavily emphasized. Michael had undergone multiple surgeries as a teenager to address the condition, but the psychological scars ran much deeper than any physical healing. Sarah's defense attorney, Patricia Gomez, revealed that Michael had been using prosthetic devices and carefully timed medication to maintain the illusion of normalcy in his marriage. The elaborate deception had required constant vigilance, always changing clothes in private, insisting on darkness during intimate moments, and avoiding any situation where his wife might discover the truth about his condition. For 20 years, Gomez told the jury, my client was unknowingly married to someone who was essentially living as a completely different person in the most intimate aspects of their relationship. She had been robbed of the ability to make informed choices about her own life, her own marriage, and her own body. The prosecution, led by District Attorney James Walsh, argued that while Michael's deception was wrong, it didn't justify murder. The defendant had choices, Walsh told the jury. She could have sought counseling. She could have demanded honesty and transparency in their marriage. She could have ended the marriage if she felt betrayed. Instead, she chose violence. But the defense presented evidence that Sarah had suffered what psychologists term betrayal trauma, a specific form of psychological injury that occurs when someone we depend on for safety and security violates that trust in fundamental ways. Dr. Amanda Foster, a trauma specialist, testified that Sarah's response was consistent with someone experiencing a complete psychological break from reality. When Sarah discovered her husband's deception, her brain essentially couldn't process the information, Dr. Foster explained. Everything she believed about her identity, her marriage, her relationship with God, and her place in the world was suddenly revealed to be based on lies. The psychological impact was similar to what we see in survivors of severe abuse or torture. The most devastating testimony came from Sarah herself. Taking the stand in her own defense, she spoke in a voice barely above a whisper about the night that destroyed her world. "I had been questioning myself for years," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I wondered why our physical relationship felt so strange, why he seemed so uncomfortable with intimacy. I thought maybe it was my fault. Maybe I wasn't attractive enough or loving enough. I prayed about it constantly, asking God to help me be a better wife." Sarah described the moment she turned on the light as watching my entire life disappear. She talked about feeling like every intimate moment they had shared was now tainted. Every conversation about having children was revealed as manipulation. Every time he preached about honesty and truth felt like a personal mockery. "I gave him 20 years of my life," she said, her voice growing stronger. "I defended him to people who said something seemed off about our relationship. I blamed myself for our problems. I thought I was failing as a wife because I couldn't make him happy. And all along, he knew exactly why our marriage was struggling, but he let me think it was my fault." The prosecution's cross-examination was brutal. Walsh pressed Sarah on why she chose violence over seeking help. "Didn't you take vows to love your husband in sickness and in health? Wouldn't a loving wife have tried to understand and support her husband through his struggles?" Sarah's response split the courtroom. "I made those vows to Michael Richardson, the man I thought I was marrying. The person I was actually married to never existed. He was a character my husband created to deceive me. I can't love someone who was never real." The revelation of Michael's condition and the elaborate deception required to conceal it forced everyone involved to confront uncomfortable questions about privacy, honesty, and the foundations of marriage. Religious leaders struggled to reconcile Michael's deception with his role as a spiritual guide who preached about truth and moral integrity. The case became a lightning rod for broader debates about gender, identity, medical privacy, and the expectations placed on people in positions of religious authority. Some argued that Michael was a victim of societal pressures and religious shame that made it impossible for him to live authentically. Others maintained that his deception was a form of abuse that robbed Sarah of her agency and autonomy in her own marriage. As the trial progressed, it became clear that this wasn't just a murder case. It was a tragedy that exposed the devastating consequences of living a lie and the human cost of shame so deep it destroyed 2 lives. The man who preached truth every Sunday had built his marriage on lies, and the woman who trusted him completely had become someone she never thought possible, a killer. The jury deliberated for 3 days before reaching a verdict that would satisfy no one completely. On November 8, 2019, Sarah Richardson was found guilty of voluntary manslaughter rather than first-degree murder. The lesser charge reflected the jury's conclusion that while Sarah's actions were inexcusable, the extreme psychological trauma she experienced constituted a mitigating factor. Judge Rebecca Martinez sentenced Sarah to 12 years in prison, acknowledging the unprecedented nature of the case while emphasizing that violence could never be justified, regardless of the circumstances. This court recognizes that the defendant suffered profound psychological trauma, Judge Martinez said. However, we cannot condone taking another person's life, even when that person has caused tremendous pain through deception. The sentence sparked intense debate throughout Florida and beyond. Victim advocacy groups argued that Sarah had been failed by a system that didn't recognize psychological abuse through deception as a form of domestic violence. Religious communities struggled with questions about forgiveness, understanding, and the responsibility of spiritual leaders to live authentically. But the most shocking revelation came 3 weeks after Sarah's sentencing, when Michael's medical records were unsealed by court order. The condition that had caused him to live in such shame and secrecy was far more complex than anyone had realized. Medical expert testimony revealed that Michael's condition was actually quite manageable and that modern medicine could have provided solutions that would have allowed him to live normally without deception. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, a specialist in the condition Michael had been hiding, testified that shame and misinformation about the condition often led patients to make dramatic, unnecessary choices to conceal it. With proper medical care and psychological support, patients with this condition can live completely normal lives, she said. The level of deception Mr. Richardson felt was necessary suggests he never received adequate counseling about his condition. This revelation added another layer of tragedy to an already heartbreaking case. Michael had destroyed his marriage and ultimately his life trying to hide something that, with proper treatment and support, need not have been hidden at all. The conservative religious environment in which he was raised had convinced him that his condition made him fundamentally flawed as a man, leading him to choose deception over seeking help. Sarah's defense team filed an appeal, arguing that the medical evidence showed Michael's deception was even more unnecessary and cruel than originally understood. They contended that knowing Michael could have lived honestly but chose instead to deceive his wife for 20 years proved the psychological trauma was even more severe than the court had recognized. The appeal was unsuccessful, but the case had already changed conversations about marriage, honesty, and the nature of consent in relationships. Law schools began using the Richardson case to discuss the legal implications of deception in intimate relationships. Medical schools incorporated it into ethics curricula about patient counseling and shame surrounding medical conditions. The Sunshine Community Church never recovered from the scandal. Membership declined by over 60% in the year following Michael's death. The building was eventually sold to a different denomination, and most of the former congregations scattered to other churches throughout the region. Some members continued to defend Michael's memory, while others felt betrayed by learning that their spiritual leader had been living a double life while preaching about authenticity and truth. Sarah Richardson was transferred to Lowell Correctional Institution in Ocala, where she began serving her sentence. Prison records indicate she participated in extensive psychological counseling and eventually earned a master's degree in social work through a distance learning program. Fellow inmates and correctional staff described her as quiet, remorseful, and dedicated to understanding how her life had taken such a tragic turn. In a rare interview granted to a documentary filmmaker in 2022, Sarah reflected on the events that destroyed her life. "I don't expect people to understand or forgive what I did. I can barely understand it myself. But I want people to know that Michael wasn't evil. He was afraid, and I wasn't a monster. I was broken. This whole tragedy happened because shame and fear made it impossible for either of us to be honest about who we really were." The case raised uncomfortable questions that continue to resonate. Can betrayal ever justify violence? Was Clara a murderer or a woman driven past the breaking point by psychological torture? How much deception can a marriage survive? And at what point does concealment become a form of abuse? In the end, 2 lives were destroyed that night in Clearwater. But the scars spread far beyond the walls of their Florida home, forcing an entire community to confront the devastating consequences of living a lie. What do you think about this case? Was Sarah pushed beyond human limits by 20 years of deception? Or did she make a choice she can never take back? The Richardson case forces us to confront difficult questions about marriage, truth, and the breaking point of human psychology. Some argue that Michael was a victim of religious shame who deserves compassion for his struggles with identity and acceptance. Others believe that his systematic deception robbed Sarah of 20 years of her life and the ability to make informed choices about her own marriage and future. How would you react if you discovered that your spouse had been living a fundamental lie for decades? Could you forgive such deception, or would the betrayal be too devastating to overcome? The psychological experts who testified in this case suggested that betrayal trauma can literally rewire the brain, making rational decision-making nearly impossible. But does understanding the psychology behind Sarah's actions make them any less wrong? Drop your thoughts below. I'm reading every single comment. Do you believe Sarah deserved the 12-year sentence she received, or should the extreme psychological trauma she experienced have resulted in a lesser punishment? And what about Michael? Was he a victim of societal pressure and religious shame, or was his deception a form of psychological abuse that justifies Sarah's sense of betrayal? This case also raises broader questions about honesty in relationships. Where do we draw the line between privacy and deception? How much about ourselves are we obligated to share with our spouses, even if those truths might cause pain or rejection? The Richardson tragedy suggests that sometimes the fear of truth can be more destructive than the truth itself. And if you thought this case was shocking, wait until you hear what happened when a policewoman's affair with a sheriff's teenage son ended in blood. We'll explore a case where forbidden love, abuse of power, and family loyalty collided in the most tragic way possible. That story will challenge everything you think you know about justice, morality, and the lengths people will go to protect their darkest secrets. Subscribe for more real-life crime stories that expose the complexity of human nature and the thin line between victim and perpetrator. Hit the bell so you never miss the truth behind the darkest corners of the human heart. Until next time, remember that sometimes the most dangerous lies are the ones we tell ourselves.